Hey everyone, and welcome to Evidence Mastery with Dr. Massoud Toussi. Today, we're cracking open Chapter 1 of a truly foundational topic: what makes data real world? Real world data has totally moved from kind of the sidelines of health research right to the absolute center of modern evidence generation. Whether you're in pharma, a regulatory body, academia, or maybe you're a student just entering the field, getting a really solid grip on the conceptual scaffolding of this data is absolutely crucial. So let's start with the big fundamental question, right? What exactly makes data real world? Think about it. How does the information we gather during a standard, routine Tuesday morning clinic visit actually differ from the data we meticulously collect during a highly controlled clinical trial? It's a huge distinction, and it's literally reshaping how we evaluate medical products. But to use it right, we really need a precise understanding of both the amazing strengths and, the inherent vulnerabilities of routine healthcare data. All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, defining real-world data. Second, the strengths of RWD. Third, limitations and inherent biases. Fourth, RWD versus clinical trials. And finally, provenance and traceability. Let's get to it.
Okay, Section 1. Defining real-world data and its conceptual boundaries. At its core, real-world data, or RWD, is the raw informational asset. We're talking about data relating to a patient's health status or the delivery of their healthcare that is routinely collected. So think electronic health records, insurance claims, disease registries, even the data spinning off your smartwatch or wearable. The absolute key word here is routinely. This data isn't forced, it's captured naturally as a byproduct of just providing everyday clinical care and running standard healthcare operations. Now, here is a really critical distinction, and it was actually formalized by the U.S. 21st Century Cures Act. Real-world evidence, RWE, is not the exact same thing as real-world data. Evidence is the actual clinical conclusion we draw about the usage, the benefits, or the risks of a medical product, and it's derived from analyzing that real-world data. Basically, think of it like this. Data is the raw material, right? The evidence is the refined output. Conceptually, you can kind of picture the RWD spectrum as this messy boundary space. It sits right in between basic administrative record-keeping and formal, rigorous research infrastructure. Unlike clinical trials, where literally every single data point is purpose-built to test one specific hypothesis, RWD isn't initially created for research. That gives it massive ecological validity. It shows us how healthcare actually happens in the wild. But it also adds a lot of methodological complexity. We have to harmonize it and make causal adjustments before it can actually support heavy-hitting regulatory or health tech assessment decisions. Moving on to Section 2, the strengths of RWD and how it helps us overcome traditional constraints. There are three core interconnected scientific strengths that make RWD so incredibly powerful. We've got representativeness, heterogeneity, and longitudinality. When you put these three together, they allow researchers to capture the reality of clinical practice across the full dynamic spectrum of real patient populations. Let's look at representativeness first. Clinical trials, as we know, often exclude older adults or pregnant individuals or patients with a lot of complex comorbidities. That leads to what we call healthy volunteer bias. But consider the landmark Orbit AF registry. This thing enrolled over 10,000 patients across 176 U.S. outpatient practices. That's a massive scale. It captured a population that genuinely mirrored actual national demographics, totally avoiding the artificial exclusions you'd get in a standard trial. It brilliantly shows how RWD reflects real-world eligibility and geographic diversity. Next up is heterogeneity. This captures the sheer, unfiltered complexity of clinical presentations and treatment pathways. For example, early clinical trials proved that direct oral anticoagulants, DOACs, were non-inferior to warfarin, but only in very highly selected patient cohorts. It was actually RWD that had to step in to confirm their true effectiveness and safety across diverse, complex subgroups. We're talking about patients over 75, people with prior strokes, or those with mild to moderate kidney issues who are already juggling a dozen other medications. And finally, longitudinality. Look, a typical clinical trial might follow a patient for, a few months, maybe a couple of years if you're lucky. RWD can span decades. Take the UK Clinical Practice Research Data Link, or CPRD. It links up to national mortality and cancer registries. This allows researchers to track a patient's life course epidemiology over a massive timeline. You can observe the delayed oncogenic effects of medications or track how a chronic disease progresses over a patient's entire lifespan. It's incredible. But that leads us to a pretty important transition question. If RWD is so amazing,
Why isn't it perfect? That brings us to Section 3, limitations and inherent biases. Let's look at the methodological hurdles. The reality is, the ecological authenticity of RWD, the fact that it's so real, is its greatest asset, but also kind of its biggest liability. Because it doesn't have blinded assessments or perfectly standardized protocols, researchers face three major hurdles: confounding by indication, structural missingness, and misclassification. The classic cautionary tale for confounding by indication is hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. Back in the 1980s and 90s, observational RWD strongly suggested HRT reduced cardiovascular risk. But those studies suffered from a major healthy user bias. The women being prescribed HRT were generally more affluent, they were active, and they were highly engaged in preventative care. When the Women's Health Initiative randomized trial was done later on, it actually demonstrated an increased cardiovascular risk in certain subgroups. Unmeasured confounding in the RWD produced the exact opposite conclusion of a well-conducted randomized controlled trial. Crazy, right? We also have to wrestle with missingness and misclassification. In routine care, patients switch doctors, they change insurance plans, and that creates big structural gaps in the data. We're often dealing with data that is missing not at random, or M&R. On top of that, ICD and CPT codes, those are optimized for billing and reimbursement, not necessarily for clinical precision. A doctor might select a code just to ensure payment, rather than to reflect an exact, nuanced clinical diagnosis. So dealing with this requires advanced imputation techniques, validation strategies, and honestly, incredibly transparent reporting from researchers.
Okay, moving on to Section 4, RWD versus clinical trials and the validity trade-offs.
This whole comparison is usually framed as a fundamental trade-off between internal and external validity. Clinical trials are explicitly, rigorously optimized for internal validity. Through strict randomization and protocols, they isolate causal effects. They tell us absolutely if a treatment works under ideal controlled conditions. Real-world data, on the flip side, prioritizes external validity. It helps us determine a drug's effectiveness under real conditions, capturing broad populations and the natural, messy ways treatments are actually given. But here's the exciting part. Internal and external validity aren't mutually exclusive endpoints anymore. Today, we are actively bridging that gap. Using modern integrated evidence strategies like pragmatic trials and target trial emulation, researchers are blending the rigorous causal inference of an RCT with the real-world generalizability of RWD. Frameworks like PRICES2 are real game changers here, helping us design trials that map perfectly along the spectrum, making sure the design fits the exact research question we're asking. Finally, Section 5, provenance and traceability. Let's talk about tracking the data. As RWD increasingly becomes the backbone of regulatory decision-making, knowing exactly where your data came from is absolutely non-negotiable. You can't just hand over an analytical output. You have to be able to trace it all the way back. This requires tracking three distinct layers of data lineage. First, technical lineage, which tracks how data moves across databases and ETL processes. Second, business lineage, which maps those raw billing codes back to actual clinical concepts. And third, operational lineage, which documents the governance approvals and the human decisions involved. You literally need all three of these to trace a final hazard ratio directly back to a patient's original electronic health record encounter. To keep all this governed, the industry leans heavily on the ALCOA Plus principles. It's a framework that ensures reconstructed RWD provenance is attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, complete, and ethically compliant. To put it bluntly, if you don't have documented provenance that satisfies these principles, your real-world data is scientifically inert. It's basically useless for rigorous scientific purposes. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 1. Now, all the concepts we've discussed today, the definitions, the strengths, the limitations, the trial comparisons, and the data provenance are entirely taken from my book, Real-World Evidence, Sources, and Solutions, which will become available this year. I highly invite you to subscribe to the channel Evidence Mastery with Dr. Massoud Toussi to see many more educational explainers and videos diving deep into real-world evidence and real-world data. As we look forward to the upcoming chapters where we'll be exploring metadata, data quality, and linkage methodologies, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The data is out there. It's vastly complex and incredibly rich with actual clinical reality. But are we truly ready to harness the full potential of the real world? Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you in the next chapter.